It began with a cup of tea. On an otherwise ordinary evening, a white slave master sat alone in his dining room, sipping a bitter herbal drink prepared by hands he trusted. Outside, the plantation settled into its usual nighttime quiet. The soft creak of wooden cabins, insects humming in the dark, distant footsteps fading into silence. Nothing felt out of place. Nothing warned him that this would be the last night he would ever rule over another human being. By midnight, his vision blurred. His limbs grew heavy. Whether the tea was poisoned, drugged, or simply part of something far more calculated, no one could ever say for certain. What mattered was this. While he lay helpless in his bed, dozens of enslaved people were already moving. Chains were slipped off and left behind. Doors were opened without a sound. Mothers gathered children. Men memorized escape routes in the dark. No fires were lit. No cries were raised. They moved like shadows, guided by courage, desperation, and a plan that had been whispered for months. By dawn, the plantation was empty. Not one slave remained. The fields stood untouched. Cabins were abandoned. Personal belongings were gone. Even the tools were neatly stacked, as if to send a message. Search parties were formed. Dogs were brought in. Nearby towns were alerted. But there were no clear tracks to follow, only rumors of poisoned tea, secret routes, and a freedom operation so perfectly timed it felt unreal. Some believed it was divine intervention. Others said it was the work of an unseen leader. But one thing was certain: a system built on cruelty collapsed in a single night. This is the astonishing story of how an entire plantation vanished, leaving behind nothing but silence, questions, and a cup of cold tea. The Georgian moon hung low over Whitmore Plantation like a watchful eye, casting silver shadows across the cotton fields that stretched toward the distant tree line. Master Edmund Whitmore sat on his veranda, swirling bourbon in a crystal glass, unaware that this would be his last night as master of anything. In the quarters, a different kind of gathering was taking place. Mama Ruth moved between the cabins with deliberate quietness, her weathered hands carrying a clay pot filled with dark, steaming liquid. At 70 years old, she had lived her entire life in bondage, born enslaved, raised enslaved, grown old enslaved. But tonight, she carried freedom in her pot, though not the kind anyone might expect. "Drink up now," she whispered to the families huddled in the first cabin. "Drink every drop. It'll make you sick as a dog, but it won't kill you. Trust old Ruth." The tea was bitter, a concoction of pokeweed root, dogwood bark, and other herbs she'd learned about from her grandmother, who had learned them from hers. The knowledge had been passed down like a precious heirloom, waiting for the right moment. Young Thomas, barely 19, wrinkled his nose at the smell. "Miss Ruth, what's this for?" "Freedom, child," she said simply. "Tonight, we all get violently ill. Tomorrow, Master Whitmore will think God himself struck down his property. And tomorrow night, when he's convinced we're too sick to move, we run." The plan had been months in the making. Ruth had been observing, listening, and plotting with a patience born of decades. She had watched Whitmore grow more confident, more careless. He had dismissed half his overseers last spring to save money, convinced that his enslaved workers were too broken to rebel, too fearful to flee. He was wrong. In the second cabin, Ruth found Sarah and her 3 children. Sarah's back still bore the scars from Whitmore's whip, punishment for the crime of protecting her daughter from his advances. Her hands shook as she took the cup. "Is this truly safe for the children?" she asked. "Safer than staying," Ruth replied. "They'll vomit, get the fever sweats, feel terrible weak. But by tomorrow evening, the worst will pass. I've measured it careful. My grandmother used this same remedy to fake sickness when the work was too much, when beatings were coming. Tonight, we all use it together." One by one, the families drank. In each cabin, the same scene played out, fear mixing with hope, doubt wrestling with desperation. There were 43 souls on Whitmore Plantation, men, women, and children, ranging from old Ruth at 70 down to baby Marcus, not yet 1 year old. Big Moses, the blacksmith, was skeptical. "And you sure this won't kill us? Because if we're going to die anyway, I'd rather die fighting." "You won't need to fight. Not tonight," Ruth assured him. "Whitmore thinks we're cattle. He won't suspect cattle of plotting. We drink, we get sick, he thinks it's contaminated well water or spoiled food, and he waits for us to recover, because we're too valuable to let die. Then we go." By midnight, the first waves of illness began. The sounds of retching and moaning echoed through the quarters. It sounded terrible because it was terrible. Ruth hadn't lied about that part. But she had been precise in her measurements, learned through careful experimentation on herself over many months. She knew exactly how much would incapacitate without killing. At dawn, Whitmore's housekeeper, a free woman named Mrs. Patterson, discovered the situation and rushed to wake the master. Sir, something terrible has happened in the quarters." Edmund Whitmore stumbled from his bed, still foggy with bourbon and sleep. "What is it, woman? Speak plainly." "They're all sick, sir. Every last one of them. Vomiting, fever, can barely stand." Whitmore's first thought wasn't compassion. It was calculation. 43 workers represented thousands of dollars in property value. He had debts, mortgages, a lifestyle to maintain. "Send for the doctor immediately," he barked, "and check the well water, check the food stores, find out what caused this." Dr. Morrison arrived by mid-morning, a portly man who treated enslaved people with the same detachment he might show cattle or horses. He moved through the quarters, observing symptoms, checking pulses, peering at tongues. "Appears to be some kind of food poisoning or contaminated water," he concluded. "Keep them hydrated if they can hold it down. They should recover in a few days. Nothing to be done but wait it out." Whitmore paced his veranda anxiously. "A few days. I have cotton ready for picking. I have orders to fill." "Nature doesn't care about your schedule, Edmund," the doctor replied dryly. "Be grateful it's not cholera or worse. You could lose them all." Throughout that first day, the illness raged through the quarters. But Ruth moved among her people when Whitmore wasn't watching, whispering encouragement, reminding them to stay strong, to keep up the appearance. The children were the hardest. Their genuine suffering broke hearts. But their mothers held them close and promised that tomorrow would bring better things. As night fell again, Ruth gathered the few who could stand without being seen. In the darkness of her cabin, she laid out the plan. "Tomorrow night, the moon will be at its darkest. We leave 2 hours after midnight. Take nothing but what you can carry quiet. The children must be kept silent. We have herbs for that, if needed. We head north through the swamp. I know the way." "The swamp?" Moses questioned. "Dogs can't track through water, but it's dangerous, full of snakes and gators." "Less dangerous than staying," Ruth said firmly. "And I know the paths. My grandson made it through 5 years ago. He left me a map before he went north, hidden it in my Bible all this time. He's waiting in Tennessee with others who help runaways. 3 days through the swamp, then 2 days through the forest, and we reached the first safe house." Young Thomas asked the question on everyone's mind. "What if we're caught?" The cabin fell silent. They all knew the answer. Recaptured runaways faced brutal punishment, whipping, branding, sail to the deep south, or worse. Whitmore had a reputation for viciousness when crossed. "Then we die trying to be free rather than living as property," Ruth said quietly. "But we won't be caught. Whitmore thinks we're barely alive right now. He won't expect us to move for days. By the time he realizes we're gone, we'll have a 2-day head start." The second day proceeded as Ruth had predicted. Whitmore checked on his property periodically, wrinkling his nose at the smell of sickness, calculating lost revenue. Dr. Morrison visited again and confirmed that the worst seemed to be passing. "They should be back on their feet in another day or two," he said. "Weak, certainly, but mobile." "Good," Whitmore muttered. "I've lost enough money already." That evening, as Whitmore sat down to his supper of roasted duck and fine wine, Ruth distributed the last doses of her tea, smaller amounts this time, just enough to maintain the appearance of illness without genuine debilitation. They needed their strength for what was coming. At midnight, Sarah quietly gave her children the sleeping herbs Ruth had prepared, gentle doses that would keep them drowsy and quiet for the journey ahead. In every cabin, final preparations were made in near total silence. Moses had forged tools during his work in the blacksmith shop over the past months, hiding them away. Small knives, fire-starting implements, tools for cutting through brush. These were distributed. The hours crawled past. At 2 a.m, Ruth stepped out of her cabin and looked up at the starless sky. The dark moon. Perfect. One by one, they emerged, shadows moving among shadows. 43 souls gathering in the cotton field, moving with practiced silence toward the tree line that marked the beginning of the swamp. Moses carried baby Marcus, while Sarah led her other children by the hand. Big Thomas had his elderly mother on his back. Families helped each other, the strong supporting the weak. They moved as one body, one purpose. Ruth led them forward, her old legs surprisingly steady, her mind clear with purpose. She had memorized the route from her grandson's hidden instructions. Through the swamp, past the old cypress with the split trunk, across the shallow creek where the water ran over smooth stones, through the thicket where the wild roses grew. The swamp embraced them with its humid darkness. Water squelched beneath their feet. Strange sounds echoed through the cypress trees. The calls of night birds, the splash of things unseen, the rustle of wind through Spanish moss. The children stayed remarkably quiet, drugged into compliant drowsiness or simply sensing the gravity of the moment. They walked through the night, through water sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep. Ruth had warned them about the snakes, the alligators, the sinkholes. They moved carefully, testing each step. As dawn approached, they reached a small island of solid ground deep in the swamp, a place Ruth had identified as their first rest stop. Here, hidden beneath overhanging vegetation, they collapsed in exhaustion. "We sleep in shifts," Ruth instructed. "Half watch while half rest. When night comes again, we move." Back at the plantation, morning came with birdsong and golden light. Mrs. Patterson went to the quarters to check on the sick, carrying a pot of thin broth. She found empty cabins. Her scream brought Whitmore running from his breakfast table. He stood in the doorway of the first cabin, his face transforming from confusion to shock to purple rage. Gone! They're all gone! He ran from cabin to cabin, finding the same thing. Empty beds, a few scattered possessions, but no people. 43 people had vanished like morning mist. "The dogs!" he roared. "Get the dogs! Send riders! They can't have gone far. They were all sick yesterday." But as the dogs were brought to the quarters, they found no trail. The scent simply ended at the tree line leading to the swamp. The dogs whined and circled, but couldn't pick up the trail beyond that point. Whitmore sent riders in every direction, offering rewards, alerting neighboring plantations. But in his fury, he made a crucial mistake. He sent them east and west and south, thinking his enslaved workers wouldn't dare the swamp to the north. The swamp where malaria bred, where water moccasins slithered, where a person could disappear forever. But that's exactly where Ruth had led them. For 3 days, they traversed that watery wilderness. Ruth's knowledge proved true. She guided them through channels that only someone who had studied the route could know. They avoided the deepest waters, the most dangerous areas. They caught fish with their hands, found wild berries, drank from clear springs. Ruth seemed to know by instinct. Young Thomas proved invaluable, his youth and strength helping to carry supplies and children across the most difficult passages. Moses used his tools to clear paths through tangled vegetation. Sarah kept the children calm with whispered stories and songs. On the 4th day, they emerged from the swamp, muddy, exhausted, covered in insect bites, but alive. All 43 of them. They rested in a cave Ruth identified, sleeping deeply for the first time since their escape. When they woke, they continued north through the forest, moving under cover of darkness, hiding during daylight hours. On the 6th day, they reached a small farmhouse near the Tennessee border. Ruth knocked on the door in a specific pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. The door opened to reveal a stern-faced white woman who took one look at the bedraggled group and said simply, "Come in, quickly." They were on the Underground Railroad. News of the mass escape reached other plantations, other enslaved communities. The story spread in whispers and songs. How old Ruth had fooled Master Whitmore. How 43 people had drunk poison that wasn't poison. How they'd vanished like ghosts in the night. Edmund Whitmore never recovered financially from the loss. His plantation fell into debt, was eventually seized by creditors. He died bitter and broken 5 years later, never knowing exactly how he'd been outwitted. The group split up as they traveled north, safer in smaller numbers. Some went to Canada, some to free states, some to communities that would harbor them. But they carried the story with them, the tale of one night when the poisonous tea brought not death, but deliverance. Ruth made it to Canada, where her grandson waited. She lived another 15 years, free at last, and spent her final years teaching young people about the herbs and plants that had helped save her people. Knowledge passed down through generations, wielded at last for liberation. Sarah and her children found a home in Ohio, where she learned to read and write and taught her children the same. Young Thomas became a conductor on the Underground Railroad himself. helping others find the freedom he had gained. Moses settled in upstate New York, where he continued his blacksmith work. But now the tools he forged were his own, the prophets his own, his life his own. The Night of Deliverance, as it came to be known in their community's oral history, became a story of hope. It was proof that the enslaved were not the simple, docile property their enslavers believed them to be. They were people, capable of planning, of patience, of using knowledge and courage to seize their own freedom. And it all began with an old woman who knew her herbs, who understood that sometimes the appearance of poison could be the taste of freedom, and who believed that one night of suffering could purchase a lifetime of liberty.